Welcome to our second lecture covering Chapter 4. This chapter is the chapter that we focus on consideration, which is the value for the promise. In the first lecture, we talked about the elements of consideration. Before we do that, let's talk about the overall elements of contract. In order to have a contract, we have 4 elements. We need to have an agreement, which is our first element. We need to have consideration. Oops, sorry about that. Need to have consideration. So this is element number 1. We need to have consideration, which is element number 2. We need to have legal capacity, which is element 3, and legal object, which is element 4. We don't have to have a writing, so that's not considered an element. And we know that the agreement requirement has 3 sub-elements. We need to have an offer and an acceptance and mutual assent in order to have an agreement. Today's class, this second lecture is going to cover this requirement though, the consideration requirement. If we don't have consideration, what do we have? That's the topic. So lecture 1 talked about how do we establish whether we have consideration, and we talked about the 4 things we have to have. 1, 2, 3, 4. But sometimes we just don't have one of these elements of consideration, and so therefore we don't have consideration, so we don't have a contract. What do we do under those circumstances? What's the solution to that problem? I'm going to fast forward here, and here we have our kind of summary of where we've been to this point. And again, the lecture 1 was about the material here in yellow. And now we're going to talk about situations that lack consideration. And our first one is gifts. Now we've already actually talked about gifts in the first lecture. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But you usually don't have consideration, or at least both parties aren't providing consideration in the case of a gift. Imagine that the example I used in the first lecture is that my mother wants to give me a Monet painting. And if she isn't getting anything in return, if we haven't bargained for something for me to provide, then that would be a gift. Until she surrenders the gift to me, she can change her mind at any point in time. So that is not a contract because the other party, me in this case, hasn't provided any consideration. Now, if we did negotiate some kind of symbolic consideration, such as my children's finger painting, suddenly we do have a contract. Okay. Another category of gifts that is a bequest. A bequest is something that a person leaves in his or her will, so that when he or she passes away, this particular item or this amount of money is given to another person or another organization. So let's imagine that my mother in the very distant future passes away, and in her will she's provided that I will inherit this priceless Monet. Well, that's really a gift, right? I mean, I had no legal right to it. She could have given it to my brother or to a charity, or she could have sold it and used it for her own benefit. But she has chosen to put it in her will and to leave it to me. Well, that's a gift. Even if she shows me the will, at any point she can change her mind. She can leave it to me on Monday and leave it to my brother on Tuesday and leave it to a charity on Wednesday. She has the complete ability to change it up until the time that she dies. And obviously she can't change it once she's dead. So what is a will? A will is an instrument, and when we use this word instrument, we're talking about a document. It's kind of a weird thing we do in legal parlance, where we talk about documents being instruments. But for our purposes, we're going to treat this as if this is a synonym. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but let's just think of an instrument being a document. An instrument by which a person makes a disposition of his or her property to take effect after his or her death. So this is a gift. And we have here a will. We have John Smith writing up a will. And let's just assume for the sake of argument that John's middle name is David. So we have John David Smith leaving all of his worldly possessions, we'll say, to his wife, Teresa Smith. That would be a will. Actually, let's not make it his wife. Let's make it his second cousin once removed, Teresa Brown. Teresa has no legal basis to claim an ownership interest in John David Smith's estate, and so therefore he can change his mind about this will at any point, rip it up and completely write another one. But once, either it's through a will or through another gift, once the gift has been given, the priceless Monet to me while my mother's alive, or the priceless Monet bequeathed to me through her will, or John David Smith's gift to his second cousin, that is the moment that the title changes. That's the second that I have an ownership interest, or Teresa has an ownership interest in the item. Contract law doesn't apply to that transaction. Now let's talk about an illusory promise. As you can see in the word illusory, we're talking about an illusion. So I have a little optical illusion here. As you can see, there's a picture, and depending upon how your brain works, I guess, you either see the face of a pretty young lady here. This is her nose, and this is her eyelash. This is her chin. This is her neck. Or you see the face of an elderly woman with a prominent nose. Actually, I guess it's not a woman, it's a man, because we have a mustache here. And then here, what used to be the young lady's eye is now the old man's, it used to be the young lady's ear is now the old man's eye. You can see it's a different appearance. One might pop up the other, and that's kind of the idea we're trying to get at with an illusory promise. An illusory promise can be interpreted two ways, just like this picture can be interpreted two ways. So let's look at the definition of illusory promise. An illusory promise is a promise whose performance is completely up to the promisor. The promise cannot form the basis of a valid contract. So here's an example of an illusory promise. I will buy one of your widgets when I need it. Well, who decides when I need it? I do. So if I decide I don't want to ever buy one of your widgets, I don't have to. And you can't ever sue me over it, because you can never prove that I needed it if I don't think I did need it. So it sounds like a promise. It will oftentimes use promise language, even the word promise. But there's no way that you can ever contest performance under the terms of an illusory promise. So because the promisor really hasn't bound himself or herself to a particular action, there is no consideration. Even if the other person has provided consideration, there's no mutuality, because the promisor really isn't bound. Let me give you another example. Imagine that Bob has a bakery. And I go into his bakery on Wednesday and I say, listen, Bob, I'm having a dinner party on Friday night, and I really would like to have one of your very lovely cakes to be my dessert at the end of the dinner party. It's an important meeting with some of my clients, and I really want to wow them with something pretty spectacular. Bob says, it sounds great, and he shows me several cakes in his display counter, and he has some samples to give me. I look at them and say, oh gosh, they all look so good. Oh, and they're all so tasty and beautiful. Gosh, any one of these cakes would be perfect for my event. And so Bob says, well, which one do you want to get? And I say to him, Bob, you can count on it. I definitely will order one of your cakes on Friday if I want one then. So Bob's thinking, okay, I have a definite sale. She seems to really like the way the cakes look. She likes the way they taste. She has a definite need. So Friday comes, I show up at the bakery. Bob has all the same flavors of cakes that he has before, and they're all decorated equally attractively. And so he says to me, well, Groover, which one shall I wrap up for you? And I say, well, let me look. And so I look at the chocolate cake and the orange cake and the carrot cake and the vanilla cake. I look at the cherry cake and the German chocolate, and I look at them all. I say, gosh, they look every bit as beautiful as they did on Wednesday, but none of these flavors really appeal to me. And Bob is a little exasperated, excuse me. And he goes, well, gosh, what flavor is missing? And I go, I was really hoping you'd have a Brussels sprouts cake. Bob looks at me like I am in fact crazy. He goes, I've never even heard of a Brussels sprouts cake. I didn't have one on Wednesday. You're right, you didn't. But just that sounds so good right now. I really think I'm going to go to another bakery and see if I can find a Brussels sprouts cake. And so I leave. Bob sues me. He says, I breached my promise. I said that I was going to buy a cake if I wanted one. Is he going to win? No, he's not going to win, because I didn't want one. Was it sensible that I didn't want one? Of course not. It was ridiculous under the circumstances. But you can't prove that I was lying, that I really wanted one, even though I said I didn't. So an illusory promise sounds like a promise, but it isn't. It maybe sounds like it's the young lady's face, but it's really the old man's face. Here's another example. We have here somebody who is shaking a hand of a businessman. I may sell you my car if you pay me $5,000. It sounds like you've got a deal, but he said may, not will, because he's still giving himself some wiggle room. He can still change his mind. So we've talked about two categories of situations that lack consideration: gifts and illusory promises. In both cases, we don't have contracts, and they're not going to be enforceable until, in the case of gifts, the gift is actually surrendered. So let's go to our next category, which is moral consideration. And this is going to fit very closely with past consideration. We're going to talk about them separately, but you'll see how closely aligned they are. So moral consideration. This is when somebody acts gratuitously, generously. Imagine that my next door neighbor, I'm picking up my mail in the morning, and my next door neighbor is also picking up his mail, and he's coughing. It's Bob, we'll say. And he's obviously really under the weather. And I say, Bob, you seem like you're under the weather. Are you okay? And Bob goes, I'm just so miserable. The doctors diagnosed me with the flu. They say I'm probably not going to be better for several days. I'm just hanging in there, staying in bed, just trying to make it through the next few days. And I say, well, Bob, gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that you've been under the weather. And I say, you know what, Bob? I'm going to mow your lawn this week. We'll say it's in the middle of the summer. I guess you don't get flu in the middle of summer, but let's imagine Bob has some illness that you get in the middle of summer. And lo and behold, I mow my lawns on Wednesday afternoons. And I mow my lawn, and then I just go on over and mow Bob's lawn. And about a week or 2 days later, I'm at my mailbox, and Bob is also at his mailbox, and he says to me, gosh, thanks, Groover, for mowing my lawn. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to get it mowed. Honestly, I was too sick to do it, and I didn't know of anyone else to do it. So thanks so much for doing that. And you know what? I'm feeling a little bit better now. I think I will be well enough next week so that I will be able to mow my own lawn and mow yours as well. So you can count on that, Groover. I will be mowing your lawn next week as a show of appreciation for what you did for me this week. I say, oh, thanks, Bob. That's very kind of you. Go about my business. The next week starts. On Wednesday morning, I see him again at the mailbox, and he's looking fit. He's in his business suit. He's got he's moving around easily. I say, how you feeling today, Bob? And Bob says, I'm feeling great. Boy, I feel so much better. Thank you for asking. So I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is good. When I get home, I'm going to see my lawn is nicely mowed. I won't have to worry about that. This is going to be great. And so I get home from work, and my lawn hasn't been mowed. It's looking pretty shaggy at this point. But I think, nah, Bob's maybe not quite up to it today, but I'm sure on Thursday it'll be mowed. Thursday comes, and he doesn't mow the lawn. Friday comes, and he doesn't mow the lawn. I'm thinking, well, he's waiting for the weekend. Saturday comes, no mowing. Sunday comes, no mowing. And so it's about, 7 o'clock on Sunday night, and I kind of sheepishly walk over to Bob's lawn, or Bob's front door, and knock on his door. Bob answers. He's looking great. I can see he just got back from the gym, so he's been working out. And I say, hey, Bob, when are you going to mow my lawn? I see that you mowed your lawn 3 or 4 days ago, but you haven't gotten around to mine. So, when do you think that's going to happen? And Bob says, well, let me start by saying, Groover, thank you again for mowing my lawn when I was so sick. That was so awesome. I really, really appreciate that. And I know I said that I was going to mow your lawn this week, and I haven't, and I don't plan to. And I go, well, what? What do you mean? Well, I know I said I was going to, but I'm not. So you'll need to make other arrangements to take care of your lawn. It's getting a little shaggy. I sure would appreciate it if you would address that. And I say, but Bob, we had an agreement. I mowed your lawn. You're going to mow my lawn. And Bob says, it sounds like a contract, but you know what? It's really not, because you mowed my lawn before we talked about the fact that I would mow your lawn. So I should, I mean, if I were a good person, I absolutely would return the favor. You did something good. I have a moral obligation to mow your lawn. But you know how the law is. The law isn't really that interested in moral obligations. So, you know, unfortunately, you just happen to have a jerk for a neighbor. I'm sorry for you, but that's just the luck of the draw. I'm just not going to do what I ought to. You know, too bad for you. What you should have done, Groover, is you should have waited to mow my lawn until we had entered into a contract. If you had said to me, listen, Bob, I will mow your lawn if you promise to mow my lawn next week, and I had agreed to that, then we'd have a contract, because we had entered into this arrangement before you had actually provided your consideration. So that's how moral consideration is not consideration. Let's look at another example. This is the drowning man scenario. This is a kind of a cliched version of this story. Okay, so Bob is drowning. He's over his head in the water. He's gotten a leg cramp. He's down for the count. John is walking by and sees Bob struggling. Bob is not able to speak, obviously. He's hardly able to stay above, keep his head above the water. So John dives in, pulls Bob to the shore, maybe even has to resuscitate Bob. And as Bob is laying on the side of the lake, panting and trying to catch his breath and feeling like he almost died, Bob says, "Oh, John, you saved my life. I want to give you $100." Bob doesn't give John the $100 right then, though maybe he doesn't have it on it. So John eventually has to sue Bob for it. John's problem is, though, that by the time Bob said that he was going to give John the $100, John had completed all of his good Samaritan actions. He had completed his saving of Bob. But let's assume that when John sees Bob in the water struggling to stay above water, John had instead said, "Hey, Bob, if I go out and rescue you, will you pay me $100?" And Bob had said yes to that. And then John had dived in and pulled Bob to the shore. Then there's a contract, because there is an agreement, and then both parties after the agreement provide the consideration. John rescues Bob, and Bob agrees to pay the $100. But because really the only reason that Bob is bound to pay when he only mentions the $100 after the saving is that Bob should be a good person. But Bob apparently isn't a good person. So that's how moral consideration isn't consideration. There's no contract under those circumstances. Now we have past consideration. Well, we can look at the same problem from the same situation. The reason that moral consideration doesn't work as consideration is that it's past consideration. So what is past consideration? Something for value that has already been given, which the giver calls consideration in an attempt to create a valid contract, in an unsuccessful attempt, right? Because this doesn't actually work. So if I've already completed my consideration before I've negotiated it, I'm not ever going to be able to consider it consideration. Let me share with you a story. I'm not a big sports person, so I'm going to forget the name of the actual basketball player. But this is a story. I think his first name might have been Alan, and his nickname is the Answer. He's a very prominent basketball player. Anyway, when he was in high school, he had, I think it was an uncle, but it may not have been a blood uncle, but anyway, a close family member who had been kind of like a mentor to him as he was developing his football prowess. And it was pretty obvious that Alan was very likely going to have a successful career, at least at the high school and college level, maybe not professionally. But and so as they're sitting back talking and dreaming about what the future might hold, his uncle said, listen, what you need is a catch name, something that is going to attract people to you, kind of like, Air Jordan for Michael Jordan, some kind of name like that that can be associated with you. And what I think your catch name ought to be is the answer, because you are the answer on the basketball court. Well, Alan thinks this is a great nickname. He thanks his as his uncle for it. And a couple years pass, and now Alan is about ready to enter the NBA. I mean, he is even better than they had hoped that he was going to be. And so Alan says, listen, Uncle, I'm about at the point that I'm going to start entering into contracts with, Nike and, Under Armour and all these, sporting and maybe soft drinks and all these different products. And, they are, wanting to use that tagline, the answer. But you know what? You're the one who came up with it. I never would have come up with it. So I tell you what, I want to give you 5% of whatever I get off of these transactions. And it's going to be millions and millions of dollars. So you're going to get probably a few $100,000 at least, and maybe even more. So actually, Alan and his uncle sign a document about this. Several months goes by, maybe even a few years, and the uncle approaches Alan again and says, hey, I haven't gotten any money off of those deals, and yet I see you on commercials all the time, and you're doing great on the basketball court. When will I start seeing the money? And Alan says, you know what, Uncle, let me just say thank you so much, because that tagline, the answer, has really been instrumental in me clinching some of these endorsements. If I had just been this great basketball player, but without that tagline, I probably wouldn't have gotten nearly as much money. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You've really helped me out, and I do appreciate it. But I'm not going to give you any money. And the uncle's like, but what do you mean? You're not giving me money, but when we have a contract. Well, you're right. We signed a document. I mean, that certainly happened. The problem is you told me the tagline before we negotiated it. So you had already provided all of your consideration. The document we signed didn't require that you do anything more. And so that was past consideration, and past consideration isn't any consideration, so we don't have a contract. If I were a better person, I'd probably give you some money, but I'm not. And so I'm sorry, but you're not going to get any money. So the takeaway here is that past consideration is usually the same thing as moral consideration. Moral consideration, we're focusing upon, is the person doing the right thing by not giving the money up? If we think about the term past consideration, it's helpful to think about a timeline. We have the event that qualifies as a consideration, and then we have the negotiation, when it should be the other way around. This is the ordering problem that past consideration presents. And our whole John saving Bob is a moral consideration problem. It's also a past consideration problem. Now we're going to talk about pre-existing duty, and here we have a mom with her baby. Moms have pre-existing, so their dads have pre-existing duties for their children. So that's an example of a pre-existing duty. What is a pre-existing duty? Well, it's when a person has a pre-existing responsibility to act. When that occurs, there's no bargain for exchange, when the person is merely doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's why, let's say that grandma is on the second floor of her house. The whole first floor is a gulf in flames, and Bob the firefighter shows up on the scene. He has a ladder, and he's about ready to put it up against the side of the house. He's about to climb the ladder and then help Grandma down. But before he puts the ladder there, he says to Grandma, Grandma, or Mrs. Grandma, I guess is what he would say, do you have any jewelry on you or any cash on you? Grandma thinks that's kind of a funny question, but she thinks, well, maybe it's, he wants to make sure that that's safe and we get that out of the house. And so she goes, well, yes, I do have. I've got my wedding ring and I've got some pearls here. And I've got my purse. It's got, $100 in cash. So Bob goes, well, go ahead and give that to me. Send it down to me. And so Grandma says, why should I give it to you? She goes, well, you want me to rescue you, right? I mean, that's what you would like. You don't want to burn up in that building. And Grandma's like, well, no, I don't want to burn up in the building. So if you give me your wedding ring and your pearls and the cash in your wallet, I will climb this ladder and I will help you down. But if you don't, I'm not going to put the ladder up and you're going to die. So what do you think? So Grandma thinks about it and she says, well, I don't want to die. So, okay. So Grandma tosses down her wedding ring, tosses down her pearls, tosses down the cash. Bob scoops it all up, puts it in his pocket, and then he does complete his promise. He puts the ladder up against the wall of the house and climbs up the ladder and rescues Grandma, takes her down the ladder, and she survives. Then Grandma says, well, I want my ring back. I want my pearls back. I want my cash back. And Bob said, well, it was a contract. You provided those items. That was your consideration. My consideration was climbing the ladder and bringing you down. But Grandma says, you had a duty to do that. The city of Plano, we'll say that Grandma lives in Plano, the city of Plano pays your wages. And so therefore you had to do that even if I didn't pay you any money. I had already pre-bought those services from you. And of course, that would apply to a firefighter or a police officer. It would apply to, say, a school teacher who is assigned to teach a particular student. It would apply to a mother taking care of her child or a father taking care of his child. Those are pre-existing duties. And so it can't be consideration for me to do what I'm already supposed to do. Another situation arises. Let's imagine that I enter into a contract with Bob, and Bob is supposed to paint my barn, and this is a nice barn, and I'm going to have an event in my barn, and he's supposed to have the barn completed, all the painting done by Thursday at noon, and I'm going to have this party on Saturday. We've entered into a contract, and the agreement is that I'm supposed to pay him $1,000 when he's done. I show up there at 11 a.m. on Thursday, and Bob has a lot still to do. I say, Bob, you haven't done everything you need to. I really need you to finish this up. I mean, if you start working really hard, I think you can finish it by noon tomorrow, but you really do need to get started. And Bob goes, well, it's really too late for you to hire another company to paint the barn, and you really need it painted for this event. I mean, it's half painted now. It looks pretty bad. So I'm going to need an extra $500 to finish it. Instead of $1,000 to paint your barn, I need $1,500. But Bob, I mean, actually, you're in breach of the contract. You should be giving me a discount. Well, I mean, do you want your barn painted or not, Groover? Because if you wanted it painted, I'm the only person in town who can do it because everybody else is booked up weeks in advance. So let's say I go ahead and give Bob the extra $500. So I pay him a total of $1,500. Well, then I can turn around and sue him for the extra $500 because he isn't doing any extra work for that $500. You'll see in the folder that we have here some information about the Problem Child movie. That's a similar scenario to that. In that particular case, a child actor named Michael Oliver was hired to have the starring role in the movie Problem Child. I think Problem Child is kind of a takeoff on the Home Alone series. There was a child, played by Michael Oliver, who kind of gets into mischief, and he's the problem child. Anyway, he's the main character in the movie, and he was an unknown actor at that point. But the movie was and he signed a contract. I don't know what it was. Maybe he was going to be paid $50,000 to act in the first movie, and the contract provided that if there was a sequel to the movie, not sure there would be one, but if there was one, he would be paid something like $100,000. I mean, that's a lot of money when you're a 10-year-old kid. Not a bad deal at all. So Michael's parents signed this contract, and Michael acts in the first Problem Child movie. And surprisingly, it's a huge hit. I mean, it earns millions and millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars. Huge, huge hit. But all Michael gets is $50,000, and yet he is the star. I mean, he's in virtually every scene of the movie. So of course the movie studio decides to make Problem Child 2. And so Michael shows up on the first day of the set to Problem Child 2, and he starts acting. But then he starts thinking, or probably his parents start thinking, gosh, I mean, this movie's probably going to be successful too, but all we're going to get out of it is $100,000. I mean, that's a lot of money, but compared to what the studio is making, it's nothing. So then they send Michael home. Well, the problem is that this movie, Problem Child 2, in virtually every scene, you need the problem child. You need the actor, right? So basically, when Michael isn't there acting, the whole crew is just twiddling their thumbs. There's really nothing for them to do. The lighting people don't have work to do. The makeup people don't have work to do. The director doesn't have work to do. The other actors don't have any work to do. So it starts costing the movie company a lot of money. And so the movie company goes to Michael's parents, or maybe to his agent, I'm not sure, and says, okay, what is it going to take to get Michael back on the set? And they say, well, we think, $200,000 is reasonable. The studio goes, well, okay. I mean, every day that we're not uh, on set making this movie is costing us tens of thousands of dollars. So, okay, we'll agree. We'll sign the a contract for $200,000 for the sequel. So Michael comes back. Michael acts just the way he ought to on the set, and they finish the movie, and it goes out. And I don't know if it makes money or not, but the payday arrives, and so Michael's parents are expecting to see a check for $200,000. Instead, it's a check for the original contract price, $100,000. The parents contact the studio and say, "Wait a second, there seems to be an error here. Our second contract provided for $200." Well, the studio goes, "Yeah, you know what? That contract didn't have any consideration because you know what? The first contract was what required Michael to make Problem Child 2. There were no other requirements that Michael had in the second contract, so we're just going to pay him under the first contract." And guess what? The studio was right. Michael had a pre-existing duty to act in Problem Child 2, and so he could not successfully negotiate for more money unless he was providing additional consideration. So, pre-existing duty situations lack consideration. Here's again an example. These EMTs and these police officers, when they are performing these procedures on this injured person, they have already been paid for this, or will be paid by the city for performing these services, so they cannot actually get money from this injured individual. So we've covered the 5 ways that situations can lack consideration. And in each one of these cases, we do not have a contract because, of course, we need to have consideration to have contract. So there is no contract here. And as a general rule, there's no ability of the person to force the the other party to fulfill whatever promise it was to do. Whatever it might be. So these situations are unenforceable. But now we're going to talk about the other situation, because there are some times, even when you don't have consideration, so therefore you don't have a contract, that there may be some ability to enforce the deal, even if you can't enforce it under contract law. We're actually going to look at 4 of those situations. The first one we're going to talk about is promissory estoppel. Let's first of all look at the expression promissory estoppel. We can see that promissory looks a lot like the word promise. And in the word estoppel, we see the word stop. So when you think about this, just remember that a promise stops something, okay? That can help you make sense of it. Let's go to the slide and talk a little bit more about that. What is promissory estoppel? Well, it's a legal concept. It's actually an equitable concept. equitable principle that a promisor will be bound to a promise even though it is without consideration if the promisor intended that the promise should be relied upon or to prevent injustice. When I teach this class face-to-face at this time, I randomly select a student in the class and I say, Bob. Every semester, I randomly select one student to get an all-expense-paid trip to Paris, France. I will buy you, you happen to be the lucky student who randomly got this goodie. I am going to pay for your first class airline ticket to Paris. I'm going to pay for you to stay at the fanciest hotel on the Champs-Élysées. I'm going to pay for you to have a driver to drive you to all the tourist places. I will get you reservations and pay for the food at the most fancy restaurants in all of Paris. You will be living the high life during that week in Paris. And then, of course, I will pay for you to come back. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to get an A in the course or a B or C. You don't have to pass the course. Once the semester is over, you will be given all of these goodies. Bob's naturally thrilled. This is awesome. But he's also skeptical. I mean, it sounds too good to be true. I mean, why would Groover do this? But he asks around and he finds out, yeah, Groover does do this every semester. He talks to a few students who actually got the free trip to Paris and they vouched for it. They showed him pictures and said, yeah, crazy as it is, she actually does give this awesome trip to just a random student. Not the best student, not the student with the best attendance, just some randomly selected student. So Bob starts thinking, this seems legit. And so Bob decides, well, you know what, I want to maximize this experience of going to Paris. I think I ought to go ahead and maybe buy some French language tapes because I don't know any French, and that would probably make the experience better. So he spends $100 on French language tapes. Then he buys 3 guidebooks. So he can know all the cool places, the best restaurants, the best tourist attractions to see. And he spends $40 on that. He also notices that his luggage is looking a little scruffy. And if he's going to a fancy hotel, it might be a little embarrassing to roll in with the luggage that he currently has. So he goes out and spends $200 on some updated luggage. So he spends $340 getting ready for this trip. I mean, that's a small fraction of the entire cost of this trip, but these are things that are going to make his trip more enjoyable. So we go through the semester. Actually, Bob does well in the course. He takes the final. After he submits his final examination, he says to me, well, Groover, you know, when should I plan on going to the airport? I just want to get all the details worked out. And I say to Bob, you know what? I know I said to you several weeks ago that I would be giving you this extravagant trip, but I changed my mind. So sorry for you, but no, you're not getting anything from me other than a grade for this course. Bob's flabbergasted. But you told me. Yeah, I did tell you. I lied to you. I changed my mind and I'm just not going to do it. But you know what? You can't sue me because there was no consideration on your part. You didn't have to do anything. And so while I was offering you was a gift, and I haven't actually given you the gift yet. So too bad, so sad for you. You don't have any recourse. Well, actually, it's not too bad, so sad for Bob. It's too bad, so sad for me, because we have this doctrine of promissory estoppel. If I make a promise, I may be estopped or stopped from not fulfilling it if I intended that the promise should be relied upon, or if it would be unjust for me not to be or to be permitted to get away with this. So the courts might say, what is Bob going to have to prove? Well, one thing that Bob is going to have to prove to advance this doctrine is that he changed his position in reliance upon the promise. Well, how did he change his position? Well, he took those French language lessons. He paid that money. He read those guidebooks. He bought the guidebooks. He shopped for the luggage. He spent money and he spent time preparing. He wouldn't have done any of those things if he hadn't known that he was going to Paris. So he did change his position in reliance upon the promise. And it was reasonably foreseeable that he would do so. I mean, after all, I did have given away these trips in the past, so I should have known that he might do that, and I should have stopped him. I should have said, now, Bob, I'm going to give you this trip, but please, please don't spend any money. But no, I didn't say any of that. Now, the standard here is a reasonably foreseeable standard. It's an objective standard. So we're not looking at exactly what was going on in my mind or exactly what was going on in Bob's mind, but what would a fly on the wall have thought was reasonable under those circumstances. So the court implies consideration on the part of Bob, even though Bob did not provide me any consideration, simply because it's just so unfair. I mean, basically, I defrauded or tricked Bob, and that doesn't seem right. This is an argument that is used oftentimes when charities are promised monies and the donor, I should say donor here, not donator. Donor changes his mind. Well, the charity may have already, come up with architectural plans or spent money doing certain things, and so it may say, wait a second, it's not reasonable for us to just be out this money because the donor's changed his mind. Now, of course, the smart way for Bob to behave and for the charity to behave is to provide some little bit of consideration. I mean, Bob should have said to me, now, Groover, I'll tell you what, I promise I'll come to class next class time in consideration for this offer that you're making me. Or maybe the charity could say, we promise to name the building in your honor as our consideration. But a promissory estoppel can be a mechanism to be successful. Now, the courts have some flexibility. It may be that the court decides that, yes, I do have to pay for that whole extravagant trip. Or the court might say, Groover, you don't have to pay for the trip, but you do need to reimburse Bob for the out-of-pocket expenses that he has. So the court has some different mechanisms to apply the doctrine of promissory estoppel. What's important to remember, though, is that the court is not going to say that a contract really existed. Because if you had a real contract, you don't need the doctrine of promissory estoppel. So I know this title says contracts enforceable without consideration, but it's really not a contract. I really should say agreements enforceable without consideration, because it is not a contract. It's going to be enforced, at least to some extent, but it can't be a contract because it doesn't have one of the requirements for contracts, which is consideration. Okay, let's talk about the statute of limitations. This is another fairly rare circumstance. So let's imagine that you and I are in a car accident. It's clearly my fault. Everybody agrees it's my fault. I've even admitted it's my fault. And let's say the statutory period for your claims under that particular statute or whatever is 3 years. And so you haven't filed your lawsuit yet. It's 2 years and 11 months, and we've been negotiating a settlement of what I might pay. There's been back and forth and back and forth, and time passes, and you know what happens? You miss the deadline. You don't file your lawsuit, and we don't reach a settlement until after the statutory period expires. And of course, the statute of limitations is the maximum period of time that you have to file a civil action or criminal prosecution for that particular incident. So once the statutory period is expired, you don't really have a basis to sue anymore. So if we were to settle the case, I could give you money, but you couldn't give me anything else, because the only thing you could have given me would you could have said, I promise not to sue you, but you can't sue me anymore. So you don't really have any consideration to offer. So ordinarily, once the statutory period has expired, if we somehow or another do decide to enter into a settlement agreement, there is no consideration for that settlement agreement. And so therefore, I don't have to actually complete it because there really is no contract. But that's not a very happy event. And so our court system has said, we're going to make a little bit of an exception to the rule. We're going to say if Groover, the bad driver, promises in writing after the statute of limitations has expired, we're going to require that Groover complete the promise. This is the idea of kind of justice, I guess you could say. It's not a contract. It kind of is under this idea of promissory estoppel, but it's kind of a special carved out area here. Now, if it's an oral promise after the statute of limitations, that's not going to be binding, but it has to be in writing. And in that situation, the fact that there is no consideration on the part of the person who could have sued is not an impediment to enforcing that written promise. A related term, of course, here is the cause of action. This is what the lawsuit could have been filed over, and this, of course, is what you need to look to see what the statutory period is for that claim. So what is the cause of action? It's the occurrence that gives a person the right to bring a lawsuit and to receive relief from the court. Once the statute of limitations has expired, then there is no cause of action, so there is no right to bring the lawsuit. So that is our second category for agreements that are enforceable without consideration. The next is bankruptcy, and this works actually quite similarly to the statute of limitations. So let's see how that works. Let's first of all talk for a second about bankruptcy. We have a course in the program about bankruptcy, so if that's an interest of yours, I hope that you'll consider taking it. It's an elective in the program. I'm not a bankruptcy attorney, but I'll share just a little bit about how it works. So let's say I decide to file for bankruptcy, and let's say I have $1 million worth of debt and I have $100,000 worth of assets that are available for liquidation for the bankruptcy estate. Well, what will happen is that the court will take my $100,000 worth of assets and distribute those to my creditors. But of course, there's not enough money to give a creditor $1 for every dollar that I owe him or her. The average creditor is only going to get 10 cents for every dollar that I owe. There will be a differing equation. Some will get more than 10 cents for each dollar. Some will get less than 10 cents for each dollar. But probably no creditor will get 100% of his or her debt paid off, or the amount of money that I owe him or her. So you can see how the creditors aren't going to be very happy. But let's say that I do, or the bankruptcy court distributes my assets. Well, after the bankruptcy estate is closed, now I'm no longer owing these people any money legally. It's as if I had never owed them any money. But you know what? I may choose to reaffirm that debt that I have, even though I have no legal obligation to. I might do it because I'm a good person, because I think to myself, gosh, it's really not right that I only paid 10 cents on the dollar. I got value. I mean, I drove the Maserati. I enjoyed the Monet painting. It doesn't make sense that that my creditors are the ones who are suffering for my bad financial choices. So I might be deciding to reaffirm those debts because I'm a good person. It may also be, though, which is honestly, to be honest, more likely, is that I'm reaffirming the debt for, I don't want to say selfish reasons, but self-involved reasons. It may be hard for me to engage in business activities if I haven't reaffirmed the debt, because after all, who's going to loan me money? Who's going to be willing to be my vendor, my supplier, if I haven't made good on these debts, especially those companies that only got 10 cents on the dollars? How willing are they going to be to advance me merchandise for my business or whatever the particular item is? So it may make business sense for me to reaffirm that debt. So let's assume that I owed Bob $50,000 and he only got $5,000. So in Bob's mind, I still owe him $45,000. According to the bankruptcy court, I don't owe him any money. I want to continue to do business with Bob after the bankruptcy. So I go to Bob and say, hey, Bob, I want to do business with you. Bob's like, you owe me $45,000. You got to pay that before I'm even interested in hearing about any business. And I go, well, how about if I reaffirm the debt? I'll start paying it off as we continue to have the business relationship. Bob says, okay, that sounds reasonable. So I reaffirm the debt. The problem, though, is that Bob is providing no new consideration, right? I mean, I'm agreeing to pay him money, but he's not giving me anything. I have no legal obligation to pay him any money. It sounds like a gift. And so if I change my mind later on, oh, I was going to pay you, but I've changed my mind and I'm not going to anymore. You could see how that could get to be sticky. But it's useful economically in our society to have these reaffirmations. And so the courts do enforce them. A reaffirmation is a new promise to perform the pre-bankruptcy contract. And you know what? It's enforceable without additional consideration. So that's another exception to the bankruptcy. Of course, the whole bankruptcy system is kind of a carve-out from contract law generally. So that's how the bankruptcy exception to this agreement contract requirement works. And now we're going to talk about benefits received. We've kind of already talked a little bit about this previously, so this is going to be seeming a bit familiar. When a person gets a benefit and then doesn't want to pay up, we all have this feeling of, gosh, what a jerk. Do the right thing, pay up. You know, Bob, if you're drowning and John saves you, you know what? Give him the $100. If somebody performs life-saving surgery on you, even though you were unconscious at the time that the accident happened and you never consented to the procedure, go ahead and give the guy the amount of money, or the woman the amount of money that he should have. We have that sense that if you get a benefit, you ought to pay the reasonable cost of it. The question is, if Bob, in this case, requests the benefit, then the court might say, well, there's an implied contract. You know, Bob couldn't have said all of the ins and outs. He might have just said, help me, and implied in that is, and I'll pay you. So you might say that there's an implied contract. They weren't able to do extensive negotiations because, you know, Bob is drowning. And so in that situation, you know, you haven't dotted your I's, you haven't crossed your T's, but you're getting pretty close to a full contract. But let's say that when John arrives at the lake, Bob is already unconscious. His face is down in the water. He isn't hearing anything, and he's certainly not talking. So there's no way Bob has entered into any contract. In that situation, the court can't find a contract because there can't be any agreement under those circumstances. But the court can say use the idea of a quasi-contract. And the idea here is that we're going to avoid injustice. We've seen the term quasi before in this course, but let me just do a little refresher. The way I like to think of it is a quasi. Whenever I see the word quasi, I think kind of, sort of, but not quite. So a quasi-contract is kind of a contract, sort of like a contract, but not quite a contract. It has some similarities, but it's not all the way there. And so the courts are going to enforce it kind of, sort of like it were a contract, but not completely. So let's think about this example. Let's imagine this is Bob having his surgery. So Bob was wheeled in. He was in a bad car accident. He's brought into the emergency room. He's lost a lot of blood. I mean, we need to operate immediately to save Bob's life. He's unconscious. He wasn't with any family members at the time, so there's no one who can consent to the procedure. The doctors look over him quickly and say, you know what, if we don't operate him on him in the next 15 minutes, Bob's going to be dead. And there's no way we can reach his family in time. There's no way we can revive him to get consent. So we're just going to have to go ahead and do it. I mean, isn't that what we want in our society? Don't we want the doctors to go ahead and perform the surgery on Bob? If we were Bob, wouldn't we want the life-saving surgery? I think we would. It's socially useful to do that. So the surgeons, the doctors, the nurses, the anesthesiologists, everybody does what they're supposed to do. The surgery is performed. Bob makes it. Yay, everything is great. Bob is in the recovery room. The doctor comes to see him. She says, Bob, we were able to save your life. Bob says, oh, thank you so much. And then a few days later, the doctor comes back and says, and here's your bill. Here's the cost for the surgeon. Here's the cost for the anesthesiologist. Here's the cost for the hotel stay. Here's the cost, and all these costs. Bob looks at it and goes, I didn't consent to any of this. I was unconscious when you willed me, and thanks for saving my life, but I'm not going to pay that. Well, the court would say, we're going to apply the doctrine of quasi-contract to avoid injustice. And again, we could look at this as a problem of agreement, that there was no acceptance of the terms. But we could also look upon it as a situation in which Bob didn't consent to the negotiated terms, to the consideration. Obviously, the doctor performed a detriment. He spent his time, or she spent her time healing Bob, but one of the requirements for consideration is that it be a bargain for exchange, not bargaining with somebody who's unconscious. So you can look upon the emergency room physician scenario as either being a problem of agreement, meaning there was no acceptance, or you could say there's a problem of consideration. But either way, you end up with a quasi-contract situation. It avoids an injustice, and it's socially useful, because if emergency room physicians were never paid, guess what? They wouldn't be emergency room physicians. And we all want emergency rooms to be staffed, because we never know, maybe we're the next person who's going to need the emergency room assistance. So now we've gone through the 4 types of agreements that are enforceable even without consideration. Okay, so now we're going to talk about another situation. This is when consideration is in dispute. We're going to talk about the differences between a liquidated damage situation and an unliquidated damage situation. Imagine that I have a contract with Bob, and the terms of the contract are that Bob is selling me his car, and I'm supposed to take possession of the car on Monday, and then on Tuesday I'm supposed to pay Bob $5,000. On Monday, I do get possession of the car. I drive it away. It works just fine. It's exactly the way Bob has represented it to me. I don't have any complaints at all with the car. Tuesday arrives. Bob says, "Hey, Groover, ready for my check for $5,000. You want to go ahead and write it up now?" I say, "Oh, no, I don't, actually. I'm going to go ahead and keep that $5,000. Bob's like, "What do you mean? I mean, you have the car." Yeah. "Are you returning the car to me?" "No, I'm going to keep the car." Are you saying there's something the matter with the car?" "No, it's working really great. Thanks. It's motor's awesome. It's even better than I thought it was going to be. Thanks so much. But you have to pay me. I mean, that's the contract. Sue me if you want to, but I'm not paying you today." Okay. Well, this would be an example of a liquidated damage situation, because the amount that I owe is specified. We know, $5,000. It's not $4,000. It's not $6,000. It's $5,000. And so Bob can sue me for that, and then he's going to be able to successfully get it. But let's switch up the facts a little bit. This time, when Bob says, "Are you going to pay me the $5,000? I say instead, "You know what, Bob? I think I'll pay you $3,000. Bob's like, "What do you mean, $3,000? It's $5,000. "Yeah, no, I know that's what we negotiated, but I think I'm going to pay you $3,000, and that's all I'm going to pay you. And so you need to accept the $3,000. In fact, we need to sign a document that says that you agree that $3,000 is all you really need to be paid." Bob saying to himself, "Gosh, I really need the money. I mean, I want the whole $5,000, but gosh, I need $3 for sure. And Groover's not going to give me any money unless I sign this form." Okay, so Bob signs it. I give Bob a check for $3,000. That counts as partial payment. But that doesn't remove the fact that I still owe Bob $2,000, the difference between $5,000 and $3,000. That form that Bob signed didn't change the underlying contract. So Bob can accept partial payment and still sue me for the remaining balance if the damages are liquidated. The amount is certain. But a lot of times the amount in dispute is in dispute, right? That's kind of the nature of things. The amount owed is uncertain or disputed. Let's go back to that same example. The car that I purchased from Bob for $5,000. Okay, so again, Bob delivers the car to me on Monday. I drive it away. And you know what? I mean, it's pretty good. But there's a few problems with it that I was not aware of. And in my opinion, Bob has breached the terms of the contract because of the problems that I'm experiencing with the car. I have seen that what are problems? The gas mileage isn't as good as Bob had indicated it would be. And the air conditioner doesn't cool off as well as I think it ought to. So I feel like Bob is in breach. The next day arrives. I'm supposed to pay Bob $5,000. I only pay him $4,000. I say, Bob, you know what? Um, the value of the car really is only $4,000. If it had been as good as you had told me it was, yeah, I would agree that it was worth $5,000. But you're in breach, and so I think that this payment of $4,000 is adequate resolution of this issue. So if you will sign this form that you agree that $4,000 is all I owe you, then I will give you this check for $4,000. Let's assume that Bob signs that. I give him the $4,000. Because the amount is in dispute, that partial payment can actually act as full payment because I'm saying that that's all I owe him and Bob is agreeing. And because the amount is in dispute, because I'm saying Bob has breached. So it's an important issue to resolve whether we have a liquidated damages situation or an unliquidated damages situation. Many times we see these issues arise in the context of a settlement. And here we have some terms relating to this. An accord and satisfaction is kind of a two-part settlement situation. We would contrast this with a compromise and settlement agreement. So the accord is the actual agreement. This is just a synonym for the agreement. It's the agreement between the two parties that have a dispute. The satisfaction is the payment that is mentioned in the accord. So let's say that Bob actually sues me for the remaining $2,000. Let's say we're in the liquidated damages area, and he sues me for the remaining $2,000. We decide that the case progresses, and I agree to pay him $1,500. We enter into an accord, and he agrees to those terms, and I actually pay the $1,500. And part of the reason that we agree to this is to reduce litigation costs, for example. Also, the fact that I don't have the $2,000, so he wouldn't be able to collect the full judgment anyway, but at least he can get part of it. So once we enter into the accord and enter into the satisfaction, then we can have a full discharge of the duty. And that's similar to the compromise and settlement agreement situation. Many times it's just called a settlement agreement. A lot of times people leave off the compromise. It's the same kind of two-step process that we see with accord and satisfaction. It's just one name for it. So this concludes our lecture on Chapter 4, the chapter on consideration. As always, if you have questions about the material, please don't hesitate to come by my office hours. Give me a call or send me an email. I'd be glad to think about and talk about these issues in a little bit more detail. I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Take care.